Hello, hi everyone. Welcome to Mondays at Murdoch. This is yet another interesting Mondays at Murdoch session that we have every week. And we have a very interesting topic that we are going to talk about today, which is fake news and how social media and other platforms have been used to spread rumors and all sorts of incorrect information. So this is a very, very interesting topic. I have been looking forward to this for a long time. And we have with us Tanil Seman, who is an expert in this field. She is a faculty with Murdoch University to Dubai. Welcome, Tanil. How are you?
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm fine, and I'm looking forward to our session today. I apologize for the mask. I am signing in from an office environment, so to keep everybody safe, I think this is the best approach.
That's great. So welcome, Tanil. And before I hand over to you, just a few housekeeping rules for everyone who's here. We have like a small Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So feel free to type in your questions. And Tanil, if you want to address them as we go, or do you want to do them towards the end? Both are okay. Just let me know, and then I can help you with the questions as well. And we also have Carrie with us. I'm not sure if she's here, but Carrie, if you're here, you can share your thoughts and some of your questions as well towards the end. So that's it from me. Over to you, Tanil.
Thank you so much, and I hope everybody can hear me clearly. Again, I'm in an office environment, so if it gets a bit too noisy, don't hesitate to stop me. I also have a tendency of talking really fast, especially when I get excited about the topics that we discuss. So if you feel like I'm going a bit too fast for you, or you want me to move back on a point, just let me know. Raising your hand is a bit better because I have a cue when that happens. So please just let me know. Let me just tell you a bit more about myself as we go along. I'm using a new a presentation platform here. I'm trying out Canva actually, and this would be my first workshop or webinar using Canva. For those of you who don't know it, it's an amazing tool that you can use for presentation building. It has a lot of templates in it. So as part of a social media and marketing expert here, I have to encourage you to please make use of all the resources that you have. But moving on from here, welcome to my workshop. My name is Tanil Seman, and I have a very big background in media, marketing, and social media, of course. My main background comes from media production. So as a filmmaker and film producer in the UAE, I also have a lot of experience in building messaging and how messaging works when it comes to putting it online and how people perceive that. So I'm hoping that I can pass on some of my knowledge and experience onto you, and of course that everybody gains something from this session, because at the end of the day, I don't want just another boring presentation. I feel very much that I want to engage with you guys. So really, if you have any questions, drop it in the messenger box. Meg, if you can help me with that. If not, I'll also spend some time at the end of the session to discuss, and go over the content of this. Moving on from here. So there's a famous quote coming from Mark Twain that has been circulating the internet quite a while. And that quote is, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes." What makes this ironic is that there's no evidence stating that Mark Twain ever actually had said this, but it is making its rounds, and I see this traveling around social media quite a bit. I mean, if you were to Google quotes from famous individuals or famous people, I'm sure you can get Einstein saying something about social media. Of course, there's no real way of evaluating this, but this quote will actually come into play as we move forward in the workshop. So keep this in mind as we go through, and then I'll bring it back by the end of this. So when we're talking about the new phenomenon or circular reporting, and I'm sure this is a term or phrase that I'm just going to remove my mask here because I'm alone in the office, except for social distancing rule. Oh, it makes it so much easier to talk to you guys. Okay, so when you're talking about circular reporting, so in previous decades, there wasn't much of a media reach for us to be concerned about this. So we had our, we had our several major newspapers and networks, which basically made our resources pretty limited. And they gathered the information or news quite directly from the source. So we never had a problem with supporting evidence, or we never had a problem with misdirecting or misreaching news the way we have now, especially in the social media era. So we have outlets like Reuters and Associated Press that basically aggregate and re-report stories, which were relatively rare compared to today. Now, most of our sources are actually coming from social media. So we have, our first-hand reporters. We have those who crowdsource news, and of course, we have our on the ground or organic news reporters, which are you and me. Taking a picture, taking a screenshot, sending out a news, sending out a tweet, and that gets picked up by the news agencies as well. What we're going to be discussing, though, is how that news works and how we get to a point where that news actually gets formulated or rechecked for accuracy. And that's where our circular phenomenon is coming from. So it's a speed in which information spreads, and which has now basically created the ideal conditions for a phenomenon considered circular reporting. And what this is I haven't figured out the clicking part of this. So looking at this is when publication A publishes misinformation. Now, there's a difference between disinformation and misinformation. So misinformation, we're referring to, when you post something or publish something without the real intent to distort the information or to change the ideas or the value of the information presented. Then you have disinformation, which is information coming from reliable sources, government networks that basically relate to the information that they have is intentionally falsified in order to change or distort your views or opinions. We're going to be focusing on misinformation, which is looking at information which wasn't purposely distorted, but we consider it as such. So it's considered a form of circular reporting when multiple publications report on the same initial piece of false information. So when you do that, when you have a publication A here, and he actually publishes a news article, let's say quinoa is bad for your health, or you need to drink a kale juice because it's good for detox. And they have a couple of pseudoscience, references in there, but nothing really substantial. They post this on, let's say, Daily Mail, because that's one of the channels that I noticed that most people get some information from. It has the best headlines, of course. Let's say publication A is Daily Mail. So Daily Mail posts this on their webpage, and publication B, I see I misrepresented this, publication B reposts this. Once it's reposted by publication B, publication A then cites publication B as the source of the information. What happens then is publication A, which is Daily Mail, automatically has some leeway in establishing that their information and the information that they're posting has references. So it automatically legitimizes the information that they have. What that basically means is they also call out publication B or remove the responsibility of taking back the information they had originally by saying, oh, someone quote me out, it's wrong. They then plant the responsibility on publication B. Now, this comes into play when, let's talk about the way we look at vaccines and the anti-vaccination rules that came into play. So this is dated a bit further away. It's not really in the social media era, but we still were looking or moving towards faster news. So vaccines cause autism. We've all heard this. It's still very relevant in the news, and we're still suffering from this today. So for instance, in 1988, a publication of a single pseudoscientific paper argued that obviously routine vaccinations in children caused autism. This, of course, inspired an entire anti-vaccination movement that we're still struggling with today, despite the fact that the original paper has repeatedly discredited the scientific community. The reason for that being is when this pseudoscientific paper came out and was published, a lot of other news agencies published the same paper. Now, when you have loads of different sources republishing the same information, we have a tendency to accept that as accurate news. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the news that we're reading is accurate or real. We basically take it at face value, because the more times that news is represented or republished, the more references you have to work off from. That is irregardless of whether the information is true. It's just how the information follows through. It's kind of like when you decide to go on a green juice diet because a health guru told you that it would detox you from. Evidence on detoxing from green juices is not yet solidified, and it hasn't been proven yet because scientists can't tell you what you're supposed to detox from. And it works in the same way, but it's being embodied by social media. And in this case, it was still pushed through by numerous news agencies. Of course, if you look at why this traveled as fast as it did, it also played on emotion, which is a very big factor in this. The pseudoscientific paper that they published against vaccines actually played on the emotions of the mothers who were concerned about their children at the time. And everybody knows that emotional news travels much quickly than something that's dissociated from them. And in this instance, it was worried parents. What better audience to make something for? When we move ahead from this, there's a less serious example, but nonetheless, it's kind of important. So satirical articles, for example, basically articles that make a joke of a situation or make a joke out of maybe a piece of information or a meme, that's called satire. Now, one of the problems that come from satire, especially if you look at websites like The Onion, which makes permanent jokes on articles that were written or real life events, is that because people are bound or has limited time to read through articles, what they tend to do is read the headlines. And we have a tendency, because of our lack of time, to take headlines as news. So instead of reading through the article and understanding what it's saying, oftentimes we read the headline and expect that we know everything. And we retweet that, or perhaps we by word of mouth, transfer that and tell our friends about it or family about it. And that's how the misinformation continues to grow. Now, for example, there was a joke article in a reputable British medical journal entitled "The Expenditure in Adolescents Playing the New Generation Computer Games." Now, this was actually a satire article and was never meant to be taken seriously. Instead, this article was actually referenced over 400 times in serious science publications. So now our concerns become, okay, well, if this is the case, how can we separate our news from misinformed news, or for that matter, advertisers who's trying to buy in? Yes, Sarah. I think Sarah raised her hand over here. Let's just open up the Q&A. Vaccines meaning is basically a medicine or a cure to what flu or what type of disease you have. Is it what I think? But what does this have to do with the abuse of social media? Okay, so when we're talking about vaccines, there are common diseases that have since then been eradicated from the United States by the use of vaccines. Vaccines is basically the injection that you get, your inoculations that you get to get rid of something like, for example, polio. Now, polio has been largely eradicated from the United States of America. It's considered a third world disease. Now, what happened is that when these babies were born, when polio was present, the vaccination stopped them from being able to get it, which means that you drove the infection rates way down. Now comes the new generation of people who are reading these anti-vaccination documents or research papers, as you were to say, and deciding not to inoculate their children. What we've seen now happening in the United States is there's a steady increase of people or children who get polio, even though it's an eradicated disease, that get the disease because of their choice of not inoculating children. Now, the reason this is important for social media is understanding how the media works in spreading information. So when you're looking at something like a health article, a health magazine, or a health trend, or for example, let's say information or news that comes out, which is pretty much bound to an emotional cue, that travels quite quickly. It's just like, has anyone ever heard of the baby bear gum juice drops that are supposed to be good for your health, and make your hair all shiny and all of that? Well, that's a great example of how social media works and how quick it gets. So what happens is so many people picked it up after a time, and there's no scientific value against that. And the reason this is so serious is because the misinformation can quite quickly spread. So moving on from there, yes, Shyam. Can't find the chat. Let's do the questions after we're done, because I can't actually see your questions. So let's touch on that after we're finished, if you don't mind. And I'll go through those and add into that. So what about Wikipedia? Wikipedia is one of those things that we oftentimes rely on for short form information. Many people think it's a reliable form of information. If you're in university at the moment, or you just came out of university, or you studied, I think one of the biggest things that we have as educators is telling students, listen, Wikipedia is not a reliable source. There is a variety of reasons for this. The first part being that it's user-generated content. Now, if you're an avid user of Wikipedia, you do have the use of moderators on it that basically can control which information you can post. The problem with that comes is selection bias or information bias. It's what we perceive to be true, even if we're told we're not. It's not. And we'll go over that as we go further down our presentation. But it's basically user-generated content, which means that there's not much, leeway in terms of how we can determine whether the information was accurate or not. So as more writers come to rely on such pages for quick information, an unverified fact on a Wikipedia page can make its way into a published article. This is a concern because when we look at published journal articles or scientific journal articles, what we're mostly looking at here is whether the information is verified, whether it's accurate, and whether it's scientifically proven. If one such source comes out of a user-generated file or user-generated content, we have a very, very big problem here, because the more sources that state that incorrect information, the more likely you're to perceive it to be true. And that comes out in a lot of things. So, and of course, the more times that article or that incorrect fact is posted, the more times you see on social media, the more times you see this in a newspaper, obviously makes it harder to debunk the fact, which is a very big problem as well. When we're looking in terms of the recent advances in communication technology, they have a huge benefits in breaking down the barriers between information and people. There's no denying that. But because we have such a strong desire for quick answers, it may overpower the desire to be, to be certain whether some information is valid. And we see this a lot in political campaigns, especially political messaging, especially now with the Trump campaign being over and the presidency. We see a lot of these hoax articles coming out, which basically try and sway you left or right from what what you understand things to be. And this bias can be multiplied by billions of people around the world. So if you look at it, it's not just you who receive misinformation. That information is multiplied by the number of people who are on social media who happen to see that. And they carry that through into their lives most of the time. So people around the world nearly instantaneously get the same incorrect information at the same time, which makes it so much harder to tell them, listen, what you just read is wrong, it's inaccurate, it's untrue. So, of course, when you're looking at that, you obviously have to be a lot more careful about what you're posting. So what I'm trying to tell you is avoid sensationalist media. So basically, give the truth time to put its shoes back on. So going back to the Mark Twain quote, take some time, see what your sources are, see whether they've been verified, and also check how many and what types of newspapers this was in. If you're looking at sensationalist media, we're talking about Daily Mail, The Sun, even the Independent has turned into a quick media source, which basically picks up a lot of its information from social media itself. That's organic grassroots reporting, basically you and me posting something interesting on the internet, and people are making money off of dangerous. And that's one of the concerning things as well. Has anyone ever watched a Troom Troom video? Or maybe those quick life hack videos and seeing them change nail polish color on the toes from green to blue? Or, for example, drying a phone on rice, which is of course also a big misconception as well. But these small TikTok videos that we see are another great example of how social media is growing into taking certain bits of information and redirecting us. Although it's not news-based, but that little short 30-second video has changed your perception on how to cook cake. If you scale that up to a wider issue, a wider scenario, turn that what you call the microwave cake into a worldwide issue, that's where things start getting serious. And it's not now about changing your t-shirt into a skirt. We're talking about political news, political events, or maybe even information about coronavirus. If we take a new example here, we have the biggest example right now where we're still relevant is how the coronavirus was dealt with in the States. Looking at the misinformation that was spread by Donald Trump, for example, who basically said that the coronavirus is nothing but a flu. They're sensationalizing this. They want to make us believe that it is a hoax. And we look at the world now, and we look at the science that came behind it, and very clearly, a statement as tiny as that being picked up by news agencies and being taken seriously can cost lives. So when you're looking at misinformation and how it spreads across the internet, it's pretty much like a wildfire. You don't know where it's going to go. You don't know who's going to see it. You don't know what they're going to do once they see it. And of course, we don't know the kind of information they have. And looking at the ages and how young our audience members are becoming on social media, and how at what age is starting to engage with it, this misinformation and the spread of it becomes a lot more dangerous, because some of the information cannot be corrected, because the lie around it or the sources around it are so large that how are you going to tell a child who saw something on the internet that they saw something wrong, or that the news that they read might have been inaccurate? A lot of people are not being able to distinguish between real news and fake news, and that's one of the things that we're going to look at today. How can you differentiate, a newspaper article from a press release? Because they're meant to look similar. And of course, these things are being retweeted. So misinformation spreads really, really quickly. It spreads even more quickly than real news, because most oftentimes they're sensationalistic. They're exciting. They have exaggerated headlines. And the oddity of it makes it just that much more popular. So it all comes down to the human psychology and how our brain deals with new information. And I'll explain that in a second. So when we're looking at how our brain takes new information that we're given, even if we know it's wrong, and why can't we accept that it's wrong when we do? So scientists have basically been studying cognitive bias. And when we talk about that, it's our likelihood to accept when we're wrong, and our likelihood to accept new information that comes across, even if it questions what we knew all along. So if we're looking at old wives' tales, maybe the stories that you were told as a child. For example, has anyone heard the little song "Step on a Crack and Break Your Mother's Back"? That's one of those old wives' tales that I think I grew up with, and I think many of you did as well. And I believed it very much to be true when I was a child. There were a whole bunch of those that we had growing up, but as we grew older, we could obviously understand that these things don't exist in the real world. But that's mostly because we've developed, and our way of gathering information is developed. The problem is when our source of retaining information or gathering information has been corrupted by misinformation, how do we then establish that what we know is right and what we know is wrong? So looking back at a study done in the 1970s, they looked at how people view new information that goes against what they've already been told. So as an example in this, a 1975 study of high school and college students were asked to compare two suicide notes and identify which is the real one. Most students did fine. They could sometimes identify the real note, but not all the time. And some students were told that they were either really good or really bad at the task. Now, what this accomplished is the researchers revealed that they lied and clarified that really everyone did just okay, but the students still thought that they were better or worse at the task than they actually were. The lie stuck with them. So along with other studies on everything from economic decision making to medical information, all this research simply shows that humans just aren't very logical. We don't like being corrected when we're told that something's wrong. We don't like seeing that maybe we were misinformed at some point, or perhaps that what our parents had told us growing up was incorrect. And it doesn't matter whether research shows it's not or it is. We mostly go with our familiarity, what we're familiar with, and what we understood from that. Now, a possible factor in this is confirmation bias, and I mentioned this earlier in the presentation. So we tend to be more convinced by ideas that we perceive to be our own, or which we perceive to be correct. And they're usually the first motivating factor. So that would be the first piece of information that you get. So even when we're given information that should adjust our beliefs, like learning something is straight up a lie, or it's hard for us to let go of how we initially feel about a person or a situation. So it's kind of like having that best friend and someone telling you that that best friend told a lie about you, or that best friend, you know, what can I say? She wore an outfit without telling you, or whatever it might be. It's hard for you to let go because you're already familiar with that person. You know what they are. They know how you are. So telling somebody that their best friend might be wrong in some way, of course, that is a complete different situation. So this is partially because of what psychologists call motivated reasoning. So we're more inclined to basically align ourselves with our emotional feelings than something that questions or goes against it. So we're motivated to reach a conclusion that we want to reach. So we're motivated by bias, what we want to believe and how we want to believe it. Now, on top of that, we tend to believe that our views are correct and other people are wrong, especially if their views disagree with ours. So for ladies, if you believe that your driving is better than that of men, so you don't want to listen to how someone says your parallel parking is bad and get angry and then stop wherever, I do that. But that's something that is there as well, is making sure or having that feeling of disagreement when somebody challenges your views. So in a scientific sense, this is called naive realism, and it makes us hard to separate facts and opinions. And these are also psychological patterns that show that our brains can be pretty easily led astray by misinformation because we're more willing to believe the obscure. But this doesn't explain, again, the complexity of how and why, fake news goes viral. Because again, this is something that we're facing all the time. So when we're looking at this, part of the problem might be the fact that according to a pretty comprehensive study of over half of US adults gets at least some form of the news from social media. And this is worrying because, again, we don't really go on social media to read news. We go on social media to read the headlines. We go on to look at pictures. We go on to look at videos. And again, while we're doing so, we don't necessarily we're not necessarily concerned about where this information is coming from. I'll maybe just look at a ranting piece or a ranting piece of information that comes on somebody on my feed or my friends list and read what they're saying and not give it a second thought. And the fact that you don't think about it, or you think that maybe you've read it and it doesn't matter, I don't believe this anyway, that information actually sticks with you because it's coming from a person that you're familiar with. It comes from a friend, it comes from a colleague, it comes from somebody that you might just be associated with. One of the biggest things that come with misinformation is the idea that, or the ideas surrounding that the information is coming from a reliable source. In that case, it can be something as simple as, I don't know, someone's title. So I can have doctor in front of my title, which obviously means that I'm educated, right? But doctor in what? So I'll put on my LinkedIn that I'm a Dr. Tennille Salmon of marketing and research. But do you know what I actually wrote my doctorate on? And that too, do I have the experience of it? I can say I have over 10 years of industry experience, but what does that mean? What does that number equate to? How many years was spent purely on social media? How many years was spent in production? How many years was spent on just sitting at home? And that makes a really big part of the problem. So there's so much information, and it can be hard to tell which sources are credible. like a blog. You post about how coconut water makes you live longer. Probably isn't fact checked like a scientific press release, but it might make for a viral tweet. I mean, something like that will be picked up by social media instantly. And of course, when you look at how information like that is spread, especially because we've gone so health conscious, why wouldn't that make you a buck? And why wouldn't that be retweeted? So social media companies are more motivated to promote whatever gets the most traffic because it makes them the most amount of money. And it doesn't matter whether it's fact checked or not. And it doesn't matter if it's a pseudoscience paper because they know that majority of the population either isn't interested in reading further or finding out the right information, or alternatively, they might not even know how to. And that is one of the biggest concerns that we see today. So then we're looking at how this could play into the illusionary truth effect, which is something really interesting as well. So it's the idea that we tend to believe in information we're exposed to repeatedly, whether it's true or not. So if we get the same information again and again and again from different sources, we believe it's true, whether we know it's not or maybe we believe it to be true. It doesn't matter because we keep seeing it constantly. So a 2016 study of Yale shared on the open access platform SSRN, which is basically their testing method. They exposed participants to both real and fake news headlines and basically distracted them with demographic questions about themselves. So they saw this information, but their focus is more about questions on themselves and their demographics. So later in the same session or after a week, participants were presented with more headlines. And they rated stories they'd seen before as more accurate and even pretty implausible ones. So they basically had to give these articles a rating. For example, one of the fake headlines was about a nationwide ban on TV shows with same-sex relationships. So this effect makes sense. When a whole bunch of people keep talking about the same story, it seems to have more credibility than one random dude who's shouting on a street corner. And again, this kind of works with word of mouth and what we're saying amongst our friend groups. If more and more people agree towards the same thing, no matter what you say and no matter how accurate the information you're giving them, it probably won't be heard because the majority is saying it, right? And again, who is brave enough to go against the majority? Or maybe you might not even know that it's wrong to begin with, to go against it. So then you're looking at fake news. And fake news is actually shared a lot more than real news. And there's a whole bunch of reasons behind it. But majority of the times, it's because they're more expressionistic. They're usually feel-good stories or emotional, cute stories, or maybe even something like the vaccine example that we spoke about earlier. It's something that cues against the sensitivities of the audience that they're trying to appeal to. And in that instance, it was worried mothers with young children who had the fear of doing their children harm. And it didn't really matter at that point whether that specific study had been tested or has been cross-checked or fact-checked by other scientific boards. It didn't matter whether it was even in a scientific board. It played on the emotional cues. So when it came out that that same study was cross-checked by multiple sources and it was found to be inaccurate and they couldn't reproduce the results, the damage in the perception from mothers who were emotionally attached to their children, who had an emotional connection to the article, it simply didn't matter. It made the same amount of bad impact. Whether they knew the information was debunked, it didn't matter anymore. And of course, then you're talking about how many new media outlets have to pick this up to retract the original articles, to admit, listen, we didn't fact check this, we were wrong, we need to pull this back, we need to say, do a press release. Not many news agencies would do that. Because again, who wants to look bad in the realm of social media? But then these headlines have to be shared for a reason, and fake news actually seems to be more shared. And the reason for this being by a study published in Science magazine in March of 2018 looked at how fake news is spreading using social media with a massive longitudinal data set following Twitter stories from 2006 to 2017. And keep in mind, Twitter, when it first came out, had a huge burst of information sharing explosion. So it included over 125,000 stories shared by around 3 million users, plus minus, and found that fake news actually spread faster than the articles that had published or the news that was published during that time that was truthful. And this, again, could be something as simple as confirmation bias. So this was especially true for political news compared to other categories like scientific or economic, mostly because political news, again, has an emotional cue to it, and it also changes according to the belief systems. So if you were more inclined towards one side in comparison to the other, you'd automatically have a larger type of emotional pull towards that end. So it's not as simple as blaming Twitter, of course, or even Twitter bots, which basically take whatever is going viral and pushing it further, and it actually has to do with us. So looking at these results with data from BuzzFeed in 2016, it basically shows that false stories were shared on Facebook more so than true stories during the few months leading up to the presidential election that year. And here you can argue. You can say that maybe one campaign spent more money than the other. You could say that perhaps more people were inclined to one certain side. You can debate this on and on. But the most important part of this is that the study found that the fake news stories are shared by real people, but not by software. It wasn't the algorithm that pushed this information across. It was real people sitting down retweeting or resharing on Facebook the same false news articles. What this is telling us is that individuals themselves are not being fooled by the information that they receive. And they're not checking whether, or cross checking or fact checking whether that information actually carries any value. So, again, it's not as simple as blaming Twitter. The authors thinks that the novelty of false headlines, basically how obscure they may be, could partially be blamed for the trend. But so many people are retweeting the fake news because it's surprising and it's more interesting than real news. It's the same reason why Troom or TikTok videos or these life hack videos or all of those become so popular. It's because they're fun to watch, they go against what we believe, and they challenge what we know of the real world. And of course, who wouldn't be interested in something that is against the reality that we believe? Again, and we find ourselves to want to believe that we're into the real world or that we know what we're talking about. And I'm guilty of that too. I think everybody is guilty of that. I don't always cross-check the news that I receive. I don't always cross-check the information I get. I don't have time. But what I'm doing today is I'm not asking you to cross-check everything you read or to make the time. I'm saying instead of challenging the news by saying, I'm going to check every single source, I'm saying hold on to your real world beliefs, the beliefs that you know are true, the facts that you know are real, and don't go against that unless you actually research into what it was that you want to change your opinion to. So if you know something's not going to work, just make that change. Do the research, take the time. And of course, it's impractical to believe or to ask you to check everything. It's not possible. So how can we resist the influence of false news if it's everywhere and also spreads so easily? And that's the bottom line, right? How can we stop this? So in another study on viral content, the stories that people were more likely to share were more emotionally charged, as I mentioned. So either positively or either negatively. So they either make you really angry or they either make you really happy. So it's just about removing emotion from it as well and looking at it from a different perspective. So one idea is to tag headlines with warnings if third-party fact checkers have found them to be dubious. And this is something that social media, especially Facebook, Facebook owns Instagram, Google, Bing are starting to do. They're starting to cross-check or cross-reference information from articles of text that they believe in situations that they believe have the tendency to go viral over inaccurate information. And if anyone's seen when you're looking or reading news on Facebook, it actually gives you a little button saying that this news was fact checked. I know BBC is doing it, CNN is doing it. All these news agencies are now doing it with everything that they're posting. Now the question actually becomes is if they can do this now, why couldn't they do this then? And if it's possible for them to basically analyze our news as far as they do, what gives them you know, what stops them from changing the way we read news or perceive news altogether anyways? And again, that is something that we need to look into. So don't take social media or the way the bot works or the way the algorithm works as fact. Do your own research. So in 2016, a Yale study tried something else which significantly reduced the chances that a headline was perceived as accurate, even if participants saw it a couple of times. Another tactic is to look more carefully at the news sources, obviously to see where they're coming from. It's easy to learn information bias when you're arguing with your Aunt Sue on Facebook and looking up sources to back up what you already think. And that's, again, confirmation bias. You already think this is true, so you'll automatically start looking for information that confirms how right you are. And it doesn't really matter what the sources are in that case. And of course, dig deeper into the outlets and authors to understand things like what biases they might have. When you're reading political news, see whether what your author's political position is. Are they right-wing, left-wing, neutral? How do they write articles? And what are their opinions on matters that you care most about? And again, this does take time, but once you get into practice of it and you make it a habit, there's more likely for you to start, generally reading information with more knowledge, with more criticism, which is something that you really need. And of course, looking at them critically, this is not something that you can build up overnight. And I don't think that within an hour-long session, I'll be able to give you all the tactics. But really, this is something that you can look at and start developing from now on. So that once we get deeper into how social media works and how it's growing as an industry, you'll know how to identify when you might be slightly wrong on something. And I think that is one of the most important messages that I can give you in this workshop. So I think I'm going to stop here because we have quite limited on time. Let me just check. Yeah, we have a good 15 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions, let me go through them now. Let's see some of the questions that we got. Okay, so let's look at some of the questions that we got. Does anyone have direct questions that they might want to raise a hand and unmute? Anyone? Okay, so we have one here. Okay, I'm glad you guys like the presentation. Let's look at some of the questions here that we have. So Wikipedia spreads false information. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Wikipedia is not regulated by the correct bodies. Again, there's so much information on there which is user generated. So anyone can add information to Wikipedia, either you or me. They do have some regulators that can cross-check the information, see if it's true, and then add to it or disagree and remove it. But that's also based on opinion, and there's no telling whether the information was fact-checked. Keep in mind that also don't check whether scientific papers were cross-referenced. That is not what Wikipedia is for. Wikipedia is basically like a bucket where you dump all your information in and then decide whether it's true or not, or whether it suits your answer. And then we have another anonymous. Is it true that YouTubers make money on every time a viewer watches the video? Yes, that's absolutely true. So YouTubers can monetize their videos, which basically means that they can get more money from the monetization from advertising. So the more times you click on the video, the more time you watch it, the more money they obviously get. So if their news is really, substantial, if it's very, sensationalistic, then of course, yeah, they make a lot of money through that. Okay, we have a Slim Hassan that raised their hand. Let's see. So if someone shares false information and got reported by another person, will it break the regulations of the country? No, it doesn't actually do that at all. So what happens is that you can flag it as being false information. If enough people flag it on that particular news article, you have the chance that perhaps they can remove it or they can forcibly remove it. But then again, this is also moderated. And it depends on how many people flag it. So if you're the only person here that thinks that maybe this piece of information is accurate, there's often times that that won't really make a difference unless you have a large majority attributing to the same fact. Okay, so any other questions that we have? We go down. I don't have a YouTube channel for anyone who's asked. Okay, the recording will be available on YouTube on the Murdoch site. I think Mega, you'll be able to help on that.
Hi. Yes. So we will upload the recording on the YouTube channel of Murdoch University Dubai by the end of the week. So, feel free to revisit and, yeah. There are other questions. I think we have.
I think Salim unmuted.
Yes.
He was one of our speakers in the recent Mondays at Murdoch as well. And Yaslim, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Mega. Hi, Tanay. My name is Salim Hassan. My question is as follows. What do you think is missing on the internet? I mean, as you know, the internet has not had any form of, since Google came along with search for information, there hasn't been any disruption or change to that for at least 30 years. What do you think is missing, and what do you think is needed for some sense of trust to get restored in terms of news being considered truthful as opposed to fake? What do you think is missing there?
Well, that's a very broad question, and I think it's something that we can very much argue about for years to come, if not a couple of weeks at least. But in my opinion, we're missing third-party regulators at the moment. So Facebook, Google, Bing, they've all taken it upon themselves to regulate their own content. And as soon as that happens with the type of information they bring across, especially if they have a financial interest in it, will lead to some kind of bias in what they either allow or don't allow. And of course, the more and more people are trying to move towards, AI or artificial intelligence in order to sort through the information that they're giving people, the more likely it's going to become that the more sensationalistic news or information becomes, and the more people look at it, incorrect or not, the more often we will see it. So at some point, we will still need human interaction or human engagement in trying to solve that problem. And again, I don't think this problem can be solved.
Well, thank you for that answer. But where I'm coming from is when you look at all digital content today, the only two crude surrogate methods of monetizing content today have been subscriptions and advertising, and both have pain points.
Yeah.
So people hate paywalls on the subscription side. And when it comes to advertising, if you look at all the publishers out there and the big amount of advertising spend that takes place every year, that whole sector has morphed into a duopoly where Facebook and Google are eating everyone's lunch, and therein lies the problem. So how do we get around this, in your mind, in your opinion? What is it that's going to disrupt this space?
I think it would be very naive for me to give you an answer to that question right off the top of my head, because the reality is I think advertisers and these developers and Google and Facebook, they're all grappling with the same problem. And if they have not yet come up with a solution that will suit both parties, I don't think, really, without looking into this carefully and without misinforming anybody, this needs some research.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, I can give you an answer to that, but I think a lot of these kids are students as well, and I don't want to say something that might be perceived as the absolute, because the truth is that if the big guys in the playroom can't come up with a solution, I think this will take some time, and we're still busy finding our feet. Social media is actually still pretty new to us in the industry. I don't think we've learned everything that there is to learn about it.
Right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Tanil. I completely agree with you and Slim. That is definitely a very, very important question, I believe. I think everyone, the news channels and even obviously Google and Facebook, they're all trying to figure out how to, be able to control this, right? So yes, I guess in a couple of years, there should be measures for it. Related question, Tanil, which on the question box, which says, can actually Google close or social media close information when a group of people have reported it? So answer, in my knowledge, not really, because how do you even know those group of people are authentic and verified? So I don't think that happens. But yeah, Tenny, what do you think?
There's actually a reviewing process that goes through whenever you report an article as false or as misinformation. Now, it really depends on where this information is coming from. Majority of the times, the reporting happens on the page that it is itself. So if you're on a news page or a website or something like that, that report or that basically the flagging happens on that site itself. So for example, if I'm on Facebook and I flag something as inappropriate, that goes through a review process where it's then determined whether it's removed or not. Oftentimes it does get removed. I've tested it on things, you get a lot of weird things on social media. So I have seen that that does work, but again, it depends on how many people report it, what the people who are doing the moderating process think, whether it's appropriate to remove it or not. And when it comes to Google, there is actually a formal way of complaining about something as simple as a headline that you see often popping up for you, or maybe an image that you think is inappropriate on the internet. You can actually flag it, and Google does take some steps to try and regulate that. Again, how efficient and how accurate it is, it really depends on the type of push that they're getting from people themselves and the type of reasoning behind it. And I think, Mega, what you're saying as well is that, if Facebook, Google, all of these people can remove articles by flagging it, whether it be bots or maybe political position on certain things, that's where it becomes a little tricky, and it needs some kind of moderation from that end. So what you're saying is completely true. If they can do that, that means they can sway an opinion, but they do have measures in place that check against this.
There's another question which is quite similar. If someone, by Basil, if someone shares private information of an organization, what would happen if someone reported? Again, I know that organizations have their own pages in most of these social media channels, so they do have the authority to control information to some extent, but yeah.
But keep in mind, when you're on social media and you're on a business Facebook page that you find posts misinformation or whatever it may be, you can actually report that page as a whole to Facebook developers. So you can flag them in that way too. So there are multiple channels in which you can approach, flagging information that you feel might be inaccurate or untrue. Okay, anyone else? Does anyone else have any questions? If not, I actually want everybody to have a look at a resource that I have that would really hone in, the messages that I had for today. So let me just restart this. I have some windows open. Okay. Let me open this over here. So there's a website called Get Bad News. And this is a really important resource for anybody who's interested in social media and how it works. I'll just take you through this for a second. How can I remove this bar here? Okay, so Get Bad News is actually a game, and it's a way of gamification of, social media and seeing how that works and how it talks you through how false information moves and how it moves quickly. So if you want to go into something like this and you really want to see, listen, how can you change an opinion of people based on your tweet, for example, this is based on Twitter, how that works and how you gain followers through that. So when you go through something like this, and you go through this, we're taking the position of spreading disinformation And what's great about this is it actually gives you inputs and changes according to what type of decisions you make. So when you're frustrated, ask you, aren't we all, can we get started by using Twitter to vent? Yep, let's post a tweet. And I'm just going to take you through a small snippet of this to see the rest of it. So the government is complete utter failure, resign losers. No, I'm not angry at the government. It gives you a different option. Mainstream media is a massive conspiracy, hashtag fake news. If I agree with this, I can say I'll tweet it. So within that, you can see on the follower account, my follower count goes up, and it actually checks your credibility status here as well. So for those of you who are educators and are interested, or even the students that are in this little workshop here, I really advise you go on this and see how this information works. And it also makes it fun and exciting to go through it. So words to live by, but people aren't finding very credible yet. To gain some real influence, you need to raise your credibility. Okay, I'm ready. So first, we'd like to take part in a study on fake news recognition. It will only take about 3 minutes. I'm not going to go through that because we don't have time right now. So let's continue the rest of the game. To gain notoriety, we can start by borrowing someone else's credibility. What do you want to do? So we can do a couple of things. We can fake an official account, or we can impersonate someone important. Let's do a fake an official account. Donald Trump. So this is one great example of how something like this, a resource like this, can work towards changing your opinion in politics, for example. Donald Trump is very relevant, especially right now, since he's lost the election. He hasn't accepted yet, but let's hope. So let's tweet this and see what happens. So I gained an extra 34 followers. You can go through across this game and you earn different badges against how many followers you gain with each tweet you make. It gives you some of the descriptions as well. You can check your reactions, how people have responded to that post. Again, this is all AI based and changed. And it also explains to you, what kind of changes you can make, what are the moral standings or moral obligations that you have. So this is a great resource if anyone is interested at all in just seeing how social media or a tweet can change your follower count. We have a couple of questions of people saying, well, can you make money from people clicking on your views? This is how they do it. The more people respond to something, the more followers you gain, the more money you earn. And this is a great way of explaining it. I think my box here went missing. Does anyone else have more questions? Mega, I think my question box here went missing, if you can help me.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting website that you shared. I'm gonna definitely check it out. We have an anonymous attendee who has a comment and says one solution could be to make critical web literacy a part of curriculum to make sure people understand how information and misinformation works. So that's absolutely right. I think that's what we're trying to also achieve through this webinar. And yeah, that's a very good comment. And we have a couple of other comments which say that the workshop has been very helpful. So thank you, Tanil, for that. I don't see any other questions really.
Well, just to touch on that, we actually do have a critical web literacy course at Murdoch University, and I actually teach that. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that, just hop on our website and ask Mega for information. Thank you, everybody, for all of your help. I hope you enjoyed my session. Please forward any comment or questions you may have to Mega. She can always forward it to me, and I'll get back to you on that. And I hope everybody checks out the game as well. I mean, I'm way more of an adult to enjoy that, but I enjoy it. So have a look. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Tanil. Thank you, everyone, for joining. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.